Hey everyone, thanks for joining. Today I am really pleased to be speaking with Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thomas is a contributor to New York Times Magazine, Harper's, and is a fellow at AEI. And he's an author of two books, Losing My Cool, and his most recent one, Self-Portrait in Black and White, Unlearning Race. Hi Thomas, thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
I have to say, I was trying to figure out where a lot of this stuff, only white people can be racist. Like a lot of this stuff came out. Like I got exposed to it in 2014 when I came back from overseas. And then I got sick and I was at home for about 18 months. And all I did was read critical race theory and intersectionality. And then after that, I read your book. And it was such a palate cleanser. I mean, it was like after reading nothing but critical race theory and intersectionality, to read your book discussing race, it was such an amazing palate cleanser because, I mean, I think I seriously damaged myself reading that much critical race theory.
What prompted you to do that?
Like I said, I worked with the military. I was always a civilian contractor, and I was away from 2002 to 2014. I come back to North America in 2014 from Afghanistan, and first of all, I noticed the conversation on Islam, and I'd seen it while I was overseas. It just really went bizarre. Like, people calling Majid Nawaz a racist house Muslim, and I'm like, do you know where the origin of that term, like where it actually comes from? And so I just wanted to know what happened. And then, that was 2014. I ended up getting a job in Northern Canada, so I moved. So I mean, life comes in the way as well. And I took a couple of wrong turns. I kept hearing postmodernism, but I have a political science background, and I'm like, well, that doesn't really seem like postmodernism. It's not quite the same thing. And around 2017, I started hearing about critical race theory and intersectionality, and then I started looking into it. And the end of 2018, like I said, I was up north. I got something that couldn't be treated up there. It was just I needed an orthopedist, so they sent me back to Montreal. So I was in Montreal for 18 months, and I just started reading. Like I went and got, I started with Derek Bell and read Delgado, Crenshaw, McIntosh, Peggy McIntosh, Patricia L. Collins. I read some Audre Lorde, even though that's not really critical race theory. Like Angela Davis. Like I just wanted to know where it came from. And I'm like, where did the conversation go so wrong? Like how did things start changing? So that's where, and that was it. That was the only reason I wanted to find out about it. And then, like I said, then I read your book and I was like, oh my God, finally, I was glad to read something decent again. Because back in university and college, I mean, I've read James Baldwin. I read Langston Hughes. In the mid to late 90s, I read like some Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, like even people like Jamaica Kincaid and stuff like that. So I'd read a lot of different things, but then reading the critical race theory, I'm like, it was just so depressing.
Yeah, well, if you've read Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and all that, it's been around for a long time. It's not new. What's different is, around 2013, 14, I think that a couple of things happened. One was a kind of delayed sense of profound disappointment that all of what was promised implicitly and explicitly by the election of the first Black president didn't seem to pan out in people's everyday lives. And the internet had really changed, and we were all walking around with really powerful cameras and the ability to share videos, and these videos of horrific police and vigilante killings of unarmed Black men and boys went viral. And there was, we were coming out of a terrible recession, and Occupy Wall Street had kind of started to radicalize people against what seemed like terrible inequality and probably is terrible inequality. And all of these things kind of came together. And I think that it opened a space for a profound kind of discontent and the ability for people who are discontented to find each other and reinforce one another's sense of harm, sense of grievance. And I don't know that all of this would have come to fruition without, the technological aspect. I really think that, you can't talk about why we all use campus jargon and ideas and these academic theories without talking about the way that they have spread on social media and the power of that. So I think that all of this comes together around 2013, 14. And then Ta-Nehisi Coates really, he epitomized the moment. But in retrospect, he was not the figure. He was the precursor to the figures that have arrived now, the Ibram Kendis, the Robin DiAngelos, but really Ibram Kendi, who kind of encapsulate all of the potential of this kind of dissatisfaction paired with white guilt and corporate HR, savoir-faire, and I guess just the need to protect the status quo at all costs, even if that means superficial diversification.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I work in IT, so maybe I'm biased on this. The tech side of it, and I get what people say about social media spreading it, and I understand it. Like, I know this stuff, you mentioned it's old. Like, I mean, Derek Bell started writing in the early 70s, and then before that, there was critical legal scholarship before critical race theory, right? So, like, but the intersectional framework that Crenshaw put on it in the early 90s, I think that's when she made it then kind of like engineering is to mathematics, like engineering is the applied application of mathematics. She made it an applied, quote unquote, science or applied social science. And it was when the people with that came out of universities in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And then they slowly started getting into, and I mean, people get out with universities. I'm not begrudging them getting into jobs. I'm just saying that the training had gone wrong, I think, at one point, and the thinking went wrong. I heard recently, I think it was John McWhorter speaking with Glenn Lowry when they do their show. He said, we need to get back to a 1997 mindset. And I'd said that as well. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay, I'm living in Canada, not in the States. So, up until the late 90s, to me, it looked like we were moving towards that ethic of we don't put social significance on race. We treat people as individuals. Then around the late 90s, there was a slight shift. And I think that shift just, as more and more people graduated out of these programs, they get jobs. Okay, you need a diversity program for government. You hire someone with a sociology PhD who's done African American studies or critical race theory because it sounds right, and no one really checked it. And I think that side of it grew. And then yes, the social media, it's just like the printing press. Once the printing press came out, all those ideas spread. So, and I mean, to my mind, this is it seems complicated because of the jargon they use, but it's a very simplistic way of doing it. It's like any of the self-help gurus, the Anthony Robbins of the world. They give you like a very quick fix. And so maybe people were craving that. I don't know. But yeah, there was like a perfect storm of everything that kind of happened at one time. And I'm not discounting the social media, but I think people put a lot more emphasis on it than I think part of it has to go back to the education.
Yeah, but I don't know. Most people, I mean, it's well beyond the type of people who have studied these ideas firsthand. They've become mainstreamed. I mean, if you look at the kind of Google analyses of the frequency of words appearing in the New York Times, for example, there's just an explosion since 2014 of things like patriarchy, white supremacy instead of racism, whiteness as a kind of concept and word. All of these things, they explode only 5-6 years ago. And that's not from a bunch of people having suddenly graduated with degrees in this stuff. It's from the way that the ideas circulate on Facebook, Twitter, and I mean, Tumblr was really important in this kind of stuff going mainstream.
Okay, I'm not discounting any of that, but also, okay, because I know Jonathan Haidt also says it, and I mean, that's when I came back. I came back in February of 2014, or end of February, beginning of March of 2014. And it was like, I was like, am I the frog thrown in the boiling water and everyone else has just been simmering in this? But it got into high schools. There's some high schools around 2010. And then also around 2010, because of social media, it was getting around as well. So I'm just thinking that the two things happened at the same time. If it's getting to high schools, kids are talking about it. And then kids will then, spread it on social media. And then you have so I'm not discounting the social media aspect of the spread of it. But I think that if it's coming through education and more people are talking about it, it has to come from somewhere to spread on social media anyways. It's not that social media created it. Once it starts spreading, then it gets to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. But I think there's actually very few people out there who are contributing to the conversation that have probably read Derek Bell.
Oh God, yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
I have no way of proving that, but I'd be surprised if a lot of people using these kinds of. But CRT is actually like a way of talking about things that are well beyond just what was written about in those books. It's kind of an umbrella term. I don't think that Donald Trump understands what he's talking about when he talks about critical race theory.
There's no way Donald Trump knows what that is, and even if Biden talks about it, I don't think Biden knows what it is. I mean, okay, when you mentioned that, like right after the George Floyd killing, I had friends, like I'm 51, like friends my age who I know didn't study this stuff. They're out of school. All of a sudden they start talking about white fragility and white privilege, like right afterwards. And then, I would speak to them and I'd say, do you know where that comes from? Like, what are you talking about? And they hadn't read D'Angelo. They just, maybe came up
definitely not
diversity training at work or something, and they're going off about it. And I mean, for some of them, I just read a couple of them who are women. I just read them the section on white women's tears, and then when I read that, they're like, "This is insane." But I actually, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I would like to talk to you about your book and about how you're speaking of identity, because that's. For myself, that was the one thing as well. And maybe it was different in Canada, and especially in Montreal, because you have the French-English thing. It was never so much division by race. It was more division by language. I mean, I'm not saying there wasn't racism. Like, I experienced it growing up, but it was, I had a bunch of friends, and we were, depending on the neighborhoods I lived in, we were, brown, yellow, black, white, whatever, all of it. Then the French kids were the same thing, but it was, those are the French kids, we're the English. So, I mean, the way you write about looking at race in your book, that's kind of always been my thing. Like, I didn't care that I was brown. I remember as a kid, one of my best friends, he was a little black kid named Daryl, and this was in the 70s. So I think it was the Ali Sphinx fight. I think it was the second one, and it was televised. My dad loved boxing. He was talking about it, and Ali is Muslim, and we were a Muslim family. My dad's like, he's like us. He's Muslim. So we were talking about it at school the next day, and I was like, oh yeah, Ali's like, me and my family. And everyone's like, no, he's not. He's like Daryl because he's black. To me, the black thing didn't occur to me. It was just, he's Muslim. And that was the identity. So, I mean, I really like the way you talked about identity in your book. So if you would mind talking about that a little bit, and like how if you want to just go through like how, a bit, but how your book and how you started, like how your ideas of identity changed.
Sure. Well, there's, all of us have multiple identities, and there's kind of a strange way that we have pressure to reduce ourselves to one identity, which is supposed to be the most salient about us, which in America is race, and it's often on the black-white binary. And you're right, you could look at someone like Muhammad Ali, and you could see him as a boxer first and foremost, an athlete, and that's his primary identity, or he's a Muslim, which was perhaps the most meaningful identity to him in certain ways, or he's a black man, or he's a conscientious objector. There's so many different ways that you can kind of slice somebody into an identity, and we decide collectively to make racecraft what it is in our society, to imbue it with so much importance. I grew up in the 80s and 90s in New Jersey, the son of a black father who's old enough to be my grandfather from the segregated South, and a white Protestant mother from Southern California, whose primary identity, more than being white, is probably the fact that she's a very devout Christian. I mean, that's what means the most to her. She was different from many people in her environment, and that she didn't put importance on race. She married a man she fell in love with, and she was willing to navigate the kind of social ostracization that came with that when members of her white community thought that was crazy to be married to a black man. My father comes from an environment where a drop of black blood makes a person black. So on the segregated side of the Texas town he grew up in his high schools and grammar schools, there were children of all variety of phenotype, because mixing is as old as the country is. There were black kids on the segregated side of town who were light skinned, who had light eyes, who had different hair textures, but they were all black because they were brought together by this idea of hypo descent. I grew up obviously in a mixed household with a brother. We're two beige-skinned kids, and nobody really questioned the idea that the fact that we had a black father made us a black family. My parents raised us as black boys, and taught us that if we went outside, in the wider world, no one's going to parse our ancestry. We're black, and the white kids that we were around treated us as though we were not white, and the black kids we were around accepted us as black because there's no more physically varied group of people than black Americans. So growing up, my identity was kind of straightforward, even though in retrospect I can see there were certain contradictions within my own household. But I mostly dated black or mixed girls. I always assumed that my children would be mixed like me, but they would be black. And I lived in multicultural, multi-ethnic spaces like Washington, D.C. and New York City. So I didn't really think much about any of this stuff until I was 29 and I met my wife, who's a white French woman who actually, now that I think about it, is colored the way that my mother is colored, blonde hair, blue eyes. And as we got married and started thinking about having a family, I realized that there was a high likelihood that my children might not present physically as black. And of course, when it happened, not only did they not present physically as black, my children are white-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed kids. They look essentially Scandinavian or something. And so this kind of simplistic American racial binary I had, that you're either white or black, and that a drop of black blood makes you black, made me think going into this that I would just teach my kids that they were black and that they would just kind of reproduce this idea that I had grown up with. But the physical presence of my daughter, it just knocked that kind of thinking out of my head. It really thrust the fictitiousness of race into my mind for the first time. And it wasn't that I suddenly said to myself, oh, hey, I've got a white daughter, I've got to change the way I think. It was that I said to myself, if I'm a black man who can have a daughter that looks like this, what is race as we make it really mean? And if my daughter can walk outside and look this way and people assume she's white and she can be 25% West African descended, then I think that these categories can't really capture us or express the complexity of who we are. And I want to start stepping outside of this kind of abstract color category way of thinking and organizing myself and others. And then as I was writing about this process of having a child that challenged my racial preconceptions, then I was reading Racecraft by Barbara and Karen Fields. I was reading a lot of Albert Murray. These ideas are very much in James Baldwin. I was just thinking very critically about race, not in a critical race theory way, but I was starting to interrogate the assumptions that I had accepted my whole life, and it led me to the conclusion that I don't think it's just my family that these categories fail. It's most, if not all of us, that these categories fail, and they certainly are failing us as a society that's organized all around the logic of what most of us admit is a biological illusion.
I know you mentioned in your book about the colorblindness, and I see that problem. Like, I like the idea of not putting social significance on race, but then when you're looking at policy issues, I don't think you should bring race into them. But if you're looking at, the black population in the United States, the descendants of slaves and like the communities they live in, if you want to help those communities, at one point or other, policy is going to have to involve race or color or something. So I can see the harms in color blindness where like, well, we're all the same now, just pull yourself up. Because if you don't acknowledge that, the like communities in the South, especially, or communities in the inner cities that, because of slavery or redlining or Jim Crow or, all those laws that came down, that affected those communities. So when you're looking at policy, like, I understand why the government would do it. And, just bringing up the colorblindness thing, oh, we should just treat everyone equally. It's like, well, they're not starting from an equal footing anyway, so let's fix that first of all. And you could same could be said about like small white communities in Appalachia. They're horrible conditions, so race will come into play with it. But when they switch it to like what the CDC did with the vaccine for one day, where they said, okay, well, we don't give it to old people because they're predominantly white. That's where we need a bit of a color blindness.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't, color blindness is something I do get into in the book, and there's a kind of way of wanting to do color blindness that reinforces the racism that's very real in our society. Just because I reject race does not mean that I deny the existence of racism, which is pervasive. I, for one, am very much in favor of reparations in certain ways. I don't know exactly what form it should take, and I'm not a scholar of this stuff, but there are others doing really valuable work about how, for example, people like my father were shut out of certain housing markets. They're still alive. There's actual damage done to specific people and their heirs, which could be evaluated, and there could be a number put on that damage, and people could be repaired. That makes sense to me. That has nothing to do with blood and skin. I don't think that there's such thing as reparations owed to all people who share a certain amount of pigment, including immigrants from other countries. That kind of reparations talk doesn't make sense to me, but repairing certain communities that were present in the country and the government failed them in certain ways, and that can be measured, that makes total sense to me, and that would go a long way towards helping reduce some of the class inequality that you'd mentioned. And I think that otherwise, like talking about race is often a way of obfuscating the kind of class inequality that is really harming our society. And you mentioned whites in Appalachia. A lot of policies that would really help whites in Appalachia would also help plenty of poor blacks, because the fact of the matter is that race is not exactly a perfect way of understanding material matters in society. So, and it's also not a way of understanding things like, police brutality. If you made certain changes that Black Lives Matter call for in law enforcement practices, they should be something that we can all buy into universally. They shouldn't be identity dependent. And what you get to now is a kind of racecraft that does actually posit that harming certain people harming more people, allowing more older people to die by not getting a vaccine first, so that younger people who are more diverse get the vaccine first, even if in total numbers more whites and non-whites die, that's a form of equity because it's less unequal than fewer people dying who are more black, disproportionately black or non-white. This is a kind of madness that, and you can see it's actually, we've arrived at this point faster than I would have believed we could be. I mean, since George Floyd died in May, the kind of discussions that we have now about equity, it's just not what I could have predicted when my book came out this time last year.
Yeah, I mean, okay, same here. Like I saw it in 2014. I saw it build up,
but it didn't give you until George Floyd happened. There was no. I don't think that there was any indication that these ideas, which are really fringe ideas and are kind of crazy, when like the CDC stuff is really crazy when you put it in paper and you see what they're saying. There was no indication that could happen until the kind of explosion of racial rhetoric happened after May 25th.
Oh, I mean, up until George Floyd's killing, the stuff that was coming out from the social justice left was more on the trans issues. I mean, the race, I'm not saying that, there wasn't the talk of race. I mean, obviously like Kendi and, D'Angelo and all kinds of other people, but the trans issue was really taking steam because that was getting into medical stuff. There was also women's rights involved in that. And I mean, it's picking back up now, but yeah, the race stuff right after George Floyd, and I mean, it's understandable why it happened. But you started seeing it everywhere.
It's partially understandable. It's not entirely understandable. One of the things I've tried to insist on that gets really short shrift is that George Floyd died. It was horrible. I think it was racially motivated. But, you know, you can always find an example of someone who is not Black, who has died in a similar circumstance, like Tony Timpa in 2016, I believe, who had several police officers kneeling on him while he said he couldn't breathe. It was videotaped, and they were laughing, and he died. That never caught the nation's imagination. But the thing that I think is, when we talk about which part of your identity is most salient, George Floyd was a poor man. He wasn't just a Black man. He was a poor Black man. He was out of work, and the reason why he had an interaction with the police was because he had passed a counterfeit banknote, which is something that can only happen to you if you're in a certain type of economic squeeze. And I think that, again, the racial component of it led to conversations about representation at the Poetry Foundation, in museum spaces, in elite media spaces. It really has nothing to do with, you know, there was a, you talk about trans issues becoming involved. There was a 15,000 person march for Black trans lives in front of the Brooklyn Museum, which may or may not be an important march to have, but at the height of a global pandemic. And you can't tell me that there's a complete neat overlap between the people that are concerned in poor Black communities about being killed by police and the need to recognize and uplift trans lives. There was a kind of, there was an idea creep, a lot of ideas attached on to this image of a poor Black man being suffocated in Minneapolis that were not necessarily predictable before that happened, and don't necessarily make sense for being coupled all together.
Okay, I maybe just because I was following this a lot, even when I was up north. You know, it's minus 50 Celsius for a long period of time at night, so you sit inside and you go on the internet. So I mean, there was always that overlapping. It started more and more after about 2016, just more as these theories started interplaying with each other. So I mean, like you said, it's a small number of people. So the people who are doing this strengthen numbers. So we're all for social justice. That's why, I mean, on the Black Lives Matter page, they talk about trans issues. They talk about, you know, I think they talk about, you know, they talk about gay rights as well. They mix all this together because they need, it's just strength in numbers. But then, I mean, you see that fall apart. Like there was a couple of papers that came out recently about how straight Black men are the white men of the Black community.
Oh, yeah.
You know, like things like that. I mean, you know, it's just, okay.
And, you know, this whole conversation after the election where there's a lot of frustration and questioning of whether Latinos should be under the umbrella of POC because of the disproportionate support that they were showing towards Trump. I mean, there's been a lot of rethinking, you know, the coalition, you know, and I don't know, man. No,
it's okay. There was a meeting in Toronto earlier this year, like I think it was in July, and it was brown complicity in white supremacy. So basically they were playing off the entrance convergence idea, but they were saying white people only hire brown people to show that they're not racist, and brown people taking those jobs is being complicit in white supremacy and keeping Black people down. There
was a protest for this?
No, it was an online meeting.
Oh, it was an online meeting.
And it was it was a conference that people could watch. It was sponsored by the Toronto Star, which is a major newspaper in Canada. I mean, you know, it was 2 South Asians and 1 Middle Easterner. And I mean, okay, so my family moved to Canada. Well, my parents told me this. When we moved here in the mid 70s, that was December 75. They had $12 in their pockets. You know, they both worked hard. You know, my dad started a convenience store. Then 4 years later, sold that with some friends, started a plastics factory, and we ended up having a very comfortable life. But to say that he was complicit in white supremacy for doing that, I mean, that's insulting to me.
It's crazy. Yeah.
And I mean, I keep seeing stuff like that. So now in the States with Asians going to school, like I've been following, like I spoke with Asra Namani about what was going on at her school in Virginia, and there's a new term I heard recently, like instead of BIPOC, they're saying we should call it, I don't know, BIL, B-I-L, Black, Indigenous, and Latinx, because Asian, like East and South Asians now
it's just a way of
white adjacent.
Yeah, exactly. Separating out Asians.
Yeah, I mean, it's and again,
because Asians in so many ways, they contradict the narrative of white supremacy. Yeah, I see the logic. Yeah. Well, James Baldwin, of course, his message was fundamentally that these things can be fixed through love, which is something that you don't hear anywhere nowadays. And, he also said that, it's impossible to demand that we transcend racial division, but the impossible is the least that we owe to the next generation. So James Baldwin diagnosed the racial brutality of American society as keenly as anybody, but he certainly didn't stop there. And he had a vision that's very different than what you get from an Ibram Kendi or a Robin DiAngelo, who makes tons of money by telling white people that they have racism seeping out of their pores.
Like for me, like I look at this and I still see like an education problem, and I understand like I said, the social media, but there is a book that's being taught in Pennsylvania now, and it's to kindergarten kids, and it's called Not My Idea. It starts off, I don't want to say okay, it still starts off like the how to be a anti-racist baby, the Kendi book, and it's focusing on getting kids to focus purely on race. But near the end of the book, they have a contract, and it's a contract with whiteness, and it costs your soul.
What?
Yeah. I can send you the screenshot of this, man. Like, they're telling that whiteness is always a bad idea. It's like property ownership, individual rights, like all this stuff, and it gives you privilege. It gives you wealth off labor of oppressed people, and this is to kindergarten kids.
That's nuts. I mean, I would agree that we should all be white people should be critical of the identity that they reproduce in society, but the idea that we should not all be equally critical of the ideas that we buy into and reproduce is where I diverge. I mean, I think that race itself is a construct that doesn't necessarily achieve the society that we would like to get to, that Martin Luther King had dreamed of, and that many people hoped Barack Obama would kind of inch us along towards. I think that, retiring from race, so to speak, is something that is a project we could all buy into. But the idea that everybody should reify race and buy into their kind of designation and be proud about it, except for white people who should feel guilty and should just be silent and ask for forgiveness. Not only is that ridiculous, it just is counterproductive. If you look at like an elite private school in New York, like the Fieldston School, they tried this with third graders. The Times reported on it extensively. You separated third graders into groups based on their racial identity. which was let alone a mess for mixed kids, half Jewish, half Chinese kids who didn't know which group to sit with. But you basically separated kids into their identity group. Every group celebrated themselves. Latinos talked about all that Latinos had overcome and achieved. Blacks talked about how they built the country. Asians talked about how they achieved as immigrants coming here. And white kids were supposed to sit and think about their privilege. While everybody else was celebrating themselves. And the Times reported that within a few weeks, it became a white supremacist group, because it just doesn't make sense that that one group is going to just permanently feel bad. And, even just feeling that you're there's a way of thinking that I've tried to write about in the past, which is whenever you center whiteness this way, by making it superior as the racists do, or by making it the single villain responsible for all that's wrong in the world, you give it a sense of superiority and you make it different than everything else and special. And so there's a point at which anti-racist thought overlaps quite neatly with racist ideas of white difference and exceptionalism.
I mean, it was okay. BLM, some of the BLM chapters in universities, I think it was 75. So 75 colleges got some form of segregated dorms, and the KKK cheered it on.
Of course.
But
of course,
shouldn't that give you pause to maybe look at what you're doing?
Right, and it doesn't. It really doesn't. But there's many ways in which anti-racist thinking has come full circle to start from the same premises that real white supremacist thought comes from. They just draw slightly different conclusions. So we're very far away from the kind of racial transcendence that Martin Luther King died for. We're very far away from civil rights era ideals. And I don't know how we kind of pull back from it, because what it is it is effective. When you structure society as a kind of zero-sum power struggle among racial groups, and you get quite a lot given to you by keeping white people on the hook and demanding a kind of fantasy of equity, why would you stop that if it's working? It's working so well. You have just this week, you have articles in the New York Times and elsewhere arguing seriously that there should no longer be standards for Ivy League admissions. That not affirmative action, but that there should be no screening. There should be a simple lottery that allows people that are not just drawn from pools of more or less equally deserving candidates, but that are mixing in completely unqualified candidates into the pool as well. This was an argument made in the New York Times. And it's gaining ground. So why would anybody ever stop this when it's working like this?
Also, I mean, like, I look at like something like that, but just step that back a bit, like what Harvard's being sued for right now. Now, if you give like black kids or Latino kids a bump up on their SATs and they get accepted to Harvard, I mean, you're doing a disservice to those kids, because if they're not prepared, if you had to give them that bump to qualify, I mean, I think what would be better would be saying, okay, you know what? We like the way you progressed in high school. We like your grades. We think you have potential. We'd like you to take a year as a preparatory year, state college, community college, or even like something through Harvard. And then and if you can keep like whatever, a B+ average, the next year you're guaranteed a spot. I mean, I think that would serve the student better. That would serve the university better. And at the end, serve society better, because just bringing a kid into a STEM field and then they don't do well, and then they get, either they drop out completely or they'll end up in some other course. And let's say they end up in a course and they're taking critical race theory. It's like, aha, I was screwed because white people are racist. I mean, this serves no one.
Well, yeah, mismatch theory is real. There's no doubt about it. But we're moving. What you propose makes sense, but we're moving quickly far away from that.
Oh, I know. It's like I said, this since George Floyd, the pace that this has spread is I've been tracking this for a little bit. Last year, it was in 16 states, I believe, to some level or another. Like CRT-based curriculum from K through 12. And this year, it's just, I mean, I've seen like Texas, there were 46 schools in Texas, 46 school districts that want to take on a BLM-based curriculum. Now, 2 years ago in Texas, they had a big thing where they found out they weren't teaching about slavery correctly. Like it was just like a minor thing. They weren't teaching about Jim Crow, and it was the same thing in Mississippi. I mean, that extreme is wrong as well. Like
Absolutely.
there has to be a proper way to teach this. Going over it, like, I mean, if you're seeing this in Texas, which is, I guess, now a little bit more of a purple state, but it is more or less a red state. It's getting everywhere. It's not like that, fixing the academy, getting policies, those are good. But if you don't get it out of schools, I mean, you're going to have a population that's not functional.
I mean, yeah, I in some ways we're already there. I mean, and the thing is, I don't like to always make it seem as though things would be fine were it not for the excesses of the left. Our society, like, make no mistake about it, American society is dysfunctional in many ways because of what's been happening on the right and the extraordinary anti-intellectualism that comes from that side of the spectrum, and the lack of willingness to engage honestly with subjects like slavery opens up a space for this stuff. You're absolutely right to bring up the fact that in places like Texas, they're saying that slavery was a happy institution in which the slaves were well taken care of, crap like that. That opens up the space for this. So I think American society is, it's profoundly anti-intellectual. It has been for quite some time. And the two sides, as they move towards greater extremes, they feed off of and exacerbate each other. And that's what we're seeing now.
Okay, and don't get me wrong, like, I always considered myself on the left, if you want to call it that. Like I've been joking since I came back from overseas that I'm an Enlightenmentarian. I support the Enlightenment values. I don't care about left or right anymore. It's all nonsense. But yeah, I get what you're saying about the right, but I speak out about the stuff on the left because that was, whatever that side or the center. Anyways, our sense making capabilities are gone. Like, how are you going to push back against intelligent design when the trans community, they're fighting about whether gender is real? Like when biology departments are fighting about this, like, how are you going to take on intelligent design if that comes up again? I saw something the other day. It was I can't remember her name, Kim Classic, I think it was. She ran in Baltimore. She was a Republican. She was a black woman running for the Republicans. She lost, but she just started putting out, so-and-so is married to Chinese, so-and-so is married to a Chinese person. They're all politicians. Now, this stuff coming from the left that says Asians are now white or white adjacent, or they've taken on whiteness, that gives an opening to real racists. And I don't know this person, just those tweets were racist. I don't know her. I don't want to, whatever, call her out. But to say that, that's what my issue with the stuff on the left is. Teaching this to kids, like teaching whiteness and all that to kids and getting white kids to think about their racial identity, that's going to create more assholes like that came to Charlottesville.
Well, look, when I interviewed Richard Spencer several years ago, one of the most noxious individuals I've ever spoken to, when I interviewed him, we had a conversation along similar lines, and he said the kind of heightened racial awareness that the left provokes and the way that they get white people to think about and fixate on their own whiteness, he said, is a great first step. And I just want them to make another step beyond that. Like, they think about themselves as racialized. They think about themselves as superior and operating from a position on a hierarchy. And they just need to make this final movement that turns into white pride and makes them want to separate from this multi-ethnic society that we're creating that's debasing whiteness. I mean, he was all for it as a kind of movement, and I had to say, it makes a lot of sense what he was saying. It is true. The thing that racists, and I had this disagreement with Ibram Kendi when he came to speak at Bard when I was a visiting fellow there. He said that the racist's fantasy is a colorblind society where all of the inequalities and racial differences that really exist are hidden. And so that they can just pretend it's not there. And I said, you absolutely don't know what you're talking about. If you talk to white supremacists, that's a nightmare for them, the colorblind society. They want a society where everybody is highly racialized and aware of racial difference, and then they want you over there and themselves over here and separated. They don't want a colorblind society where everybody mingles. He had no answer for that because he just assumes that that's what racists want, because he believes racial difference is real, and in that way he is reinforcing what they believe. They all believe racial difference is real. The real nightmare would be to find ways to achieve a society in which the way that you look physically and your ancestry tells me as little useful knowledge about you as an individual as possible. That's the society I want to achieve.
Same here. Like, I would much rather prefer another actor. Like, when I was working overseas, my first boss, he was First Nations. And one day we were just talking. We were sitting, I think we were in Kabul, and we're just, after the day, we're just sitting there talking, whatever. And he mentioned it. He's like, yeah, when I speak to you on the phone, or, I never think of you as someone who's brown. Like, that to me struck me as really weird. It's like, okay, I don't think about that ever. I mean, obviously, if you're looking at someone, you see their, their skin color, their features, all that. But I've never, I shouldn't say never, but I never, like, personally, I would never put that kind of significance. It was only in like the late 80s, early 90s when the PC craze started coming up, brought up race so much. Like, I mean, like I said, I faced some racism in Canada in the 70s and the 80s, and it started dying down, and we were kind of forgetting about race. But then in the late 80s, early 90s, the PC side started focusing on race more. And then now it's crazy. Like,
well, I would say I would just push back there and say that racists focus on race quite a lot too, and there is quite a lot of racism. We haven't achieved a society that would be without racism were it not for just the left talking about it. So I don't want to give the impression that that's the case, but it is true that these discourses feed off of each other. And you could say that there's a kind of fetishization of race and racism that happens on the left. And John McWhorter speaks very well about this. Things have gotten a lot better. And I am always aware of this when I compare my own American experience to my father's. He's in his 80s. He had a very different country than I've inhabited. And it's almost as though what has happened on the left is that we're not even really allowed, or it's almost impolite to really be proud of that, or to mention that, or to acknowledge that things are much better. And they've done studies on this. It's oftentimes when things do improve dramatically that people become heightenedly sensitive to whatever is still wrong. When my dad was coming up, it would be crazy to talk about microaggressions because there were macroaggressions all around, it takes quite a lot of comfort to fixate on the kinds of things that we talk about now. And so in one way, you can look at that optimistically. We've made tremendous strides. But in another way, I mean, it creates this discourse of fetishizing grievance that is very difficult to get out of.
Yeah, I mean, the grievance thing. So I worked for 4.5 years in an Inuit community in northern Canada. But what I saw up there, and just like reading, talking to people, and then like my friends who'd worked in the health department and things like that, everything was geared around these people being victims. Everything was geared that, oh my God, you're a victim. You've always been victimized. To live up in the Arctic, you have to be an incredibly resilient people, and the Inuit are. But you've had, especially in the last 20 or 25 years, they're continuously told that they're victims, and everything's done for them. Like, if they go get a prescription, instead of getting a bottle of pills saying take 2 pills twice a day, they get a sheet with all the pills distributed that they need to take every day. Like, this is the morning one, this is the afternoon one. Like no, treat people like adults. Give them the capacity to deal with their own shit. And that's where I could think that's one of the biggest problems of this is you're making victimhood a commodity.
Absolutely. It's a commodity, and it's also a source of currency. I can't speak on the Inuit. but there's a kind of competition for this currency, which buys you a lot in this moment. And so, how do you disincentivize that? That's where I think we have to think really strategically, outside of just trying to win an argument and be correct. How do you disincentivize somebody for whom this is working? Whole groups for whom it's working. It gives you cultural capital online and offline to present yourself as having been aggrieved.
If I apply for a job or whatever, I hate that section of the visible minority, whatever, and I've hated it since the PC days. Because I used to joke about it. I was in school and I was working part-time at an insurance company. I'd come to the office and I just heard today that I can't be racist because I'm brown. And they're looking at me like, what? I mean, like I heard that back in the late 80s. And just, so
well, if you're Arab, technically you're Caucasian in America.
But I was, okay. So I've done the 23andMe. No, it's just because I was born in India and my family had been in India for a few generations. So I didn't know exactly. And my dad was always proud of his Arab heritage. And he always thought he was more Arab than he was, I think. Because I turned out I was 63% South Asian.
Oh, okay.
And I was like,
so you're Caucasian / white adjacent.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, like, or what? Okay, I saw something yesterday, and white Africans aren't Africans; they're diet colonizers. I'm like, okay, well, tell that to the Northern Africa, tell that to like Moroccans or something.
Yeah. I think that, far better for all of us would be to try to conceive of values and principles that can be universally applied and that we can all buy into, and that would uplift all of us, and that would in some ways, recognize everybody without fetishizing difference. I live in France, that's the way that French society is supposed to work, and that is being stressed right now at the moment, and Macron is having quite an important discussion. President Macron is having quite an important discussion about how to make a multi-ethnic society work. And he's saying, look, we look at the American model, and that's not the model that we want here. We have a model that's based on all citizens being equally recognized and recognized as citizens of France, and not insofar as their avatars of differing identity groups. It's another way of conceiving society, and I think it's very important that vision has a home and hopefully wins out.
Okay, that kind of idea. So take the ethic of Martin Luther King, or even like the ideals of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence in the state. Like, if you build an identity, okay, you're American first and foremost, and being an American, again, I don't want to say it happened. I don't think it did, but I think we were getting close to that in the late 90s, but then it just shifted. Like, how do you change that idea of, okay, think of yourself as these ideals, and you don't make them all lofty, like, oh, we're like in Canada, oh, we're going to be kind, diversity is our strength, we're an open, like, actually, bring civics classes back, for Christ's sakes. Like, just a little thing, like, talk about the harms that were done, talk about the advancements that were made, and show that, okay, you know what, 100 years after the Declaration of Independence, slavery was ended. 100 years later, Jim Crow was ended. Civil Rights Act in 64, Voting Rights Act in 68. Show the progress that was made, and do it for those ideals. And I'll just ramble for a second more. Like, there's a friend of mine, Faisal Al-Muhtar. He started this organization called Ideas Beyond Borders. And he was a refugee from Iraq. He grew up under Saddam's Iraq. He's a U.S. citizen now. I think this is going into their 4th year. They translate books on science and philosophy into Arabic and make them available for free in the Middle East. And so he put out a call for translators in Iraq. On the first day, he got 15,000 people willing to do this, and they're putting their lives at risk. What I was trying to say is, like, he's spreading that idea. Like, can we get that back to here? I don't know if that's possible. Like that idea of, like, he's spreading Enlightenment values. Like, why are we going away from them where other people want them?
That is the question. And, if you think that means that these societies have become in some ways rather decadent, then I think that you might be onto something.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's that. It's the fall of Rome. Look, I don't want to keep you too much longer. Thanks a lot. If you've got any last words of wisdom about how to get away from focusing on race, it'd be great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. How do we get away from focusing on race? What I try to do, and I think, this is something that you can get ridiculed for saying, but I think I've come to a point where I'm not seeing race in my life. I deal with people as individuals. I'm related to all manner of phenotypes, skin colors, and rather a few nationalities and ethnicities and religions. I stop dealing with race by stop dealing with race. And I know that that's what Justice Roberts said, and it was laughed at, but we all have to kind of put the sword of identity down. It's a sword that can be picked up and used by anyone. It's used by racists, and it's used by a kind of anti-racist. And so long as people are swinging swords, a lot of us end up getting hurt. I put the sword down. I deal with people as individuals. All racism and all anti-racism, it necessarily starts on the interpersonal level. We talk all about systemic and institutional racism, but what is an institution? It's people first and foremost. Make changes in your own life. That's what we can affect. That's how I try to make these changes. And then I try to participate in conversations in good faith. I think that, a lot of what's wrong right now is that we talk past each other, really try to listen to people and try to approach conversations with the mentality that you could be wrong and you could be influenced yourself. That's my elevator pitch for how we start.
Well, thank you very much for coming on. And, since we're here and it's December, I'd like to wish you and your family a Merry Christmas.
Same to you.
Once again for coming on, and thank everyone for listening.